Happy Sunday. Today is Sunday, November 3rd, and I am checking in because I want to share some information that I learned way back when we started Game Changer from members of law enforcement. It's the whole notion of principled policing. You might wonder, like, what is principled policing? So I'm going to take you through what principled policing is. It all starts with this guy. And you might be wondering, who is this guy? Well, this guy happens to be named Sir Robert Peel. And Sir Robert Peel is generally referred to as the father of principled policing. And you might be wondering, like, what is principled policing? What is it? So I'm going to take you through what principled policing is and how this guy came up with the 9 principles of policing. Sir Robert Peel, he's known for establishing the Metropolitan Police Force in London in 1829. And his principles are still considered relevant today. I learned about this guy from members of law enforcement talking about principled policing and how cops should be behaving among society. Now, whether they're all doing that or not, they're not. But in their training, at least back in the day, members of law enforcement told me that their training in terms of how to deal with the public started with Sir Robert Peel and his 9 principles of policing. So let's go through each principle. The first principle of principled policing is that police are the public. Police are the community. A lot of people don't see the police as the community because they wear a uniform, they have these powers that we don't have. But the truth of the matter is, every member of law enforcement came from some community before they put that badge on. They were not born with the badge and the uniform on. So law enforcement is drawing their members from the general public. So in this particular principle, the first one, police officers are citizens in uniform who serve the public with their consent. And you can look at that a number of different ways. I like to look at it as back in the day when new towns were being formed, when this country was being formed, the public generally came to the conclusion that this town needs law enforcement. That's what I look at as consent. Doesn't mean that citizens in this town are going to take it upon themselves and say, we're going to be the police of this town. No, the town, the city decides we need members of law enforcement. So that's the first principle. Police are the public. So when we talk about community, and I was often guilty of this, I would say, the community and then law enforcement. Let's bring the community together with law enforcement. Law enforcement is part of the community. Whether you agree with that or not, those are the facts. They're part of our community. Second principle, use minimum force. Police should only use the minimum amount of physical force necessary to keep the peace and enforce laws. So just so you know, use of force is a spectrum. If a member of law enforcement puts their hand on my wrist, that is use of force. They consider to be the lowest level of use of force. The highest level of use of force is deadly force, typically with their gun. So, on that spectrum of force, there's a lot of things that could take place in between putting your hand on me and shooting me with your gun. One of the things that I've heard from older members of law enforcement is that they've gone their whole career and they've never had to take their gun out of their holster. Different era, I suppose, or are they just wired differently? Many members of law enforcement share they'd rather talk you into handcuffs than force you into handcuffs. And then there are those members of law enforcement who tend to be type A personalities where they will resort to putting their hands on you or higher levels of force as their first response to resistance or somebody saying something that they don't particularly care to hear. So, as a matter of principle policing, minimum use of force is one of those principles. Third principle, police should be efficient and organized. Police should be stable, efficient, and organized along military lines. Now, stable when you have instances of law enforcement agencies going through a lot of turmoil. I think it was up in San Francisco, where over a 4-month period, 5-month period, and don't hold me to the exact number, they went through three police chiefs. That's not a stable department. The fact that law enforcement numbers are down across the country, where if you talk to major cities, they will tell you that they have a shortage of members of law enforcement. If you have a shortage, that doesn't sound like stability to me. Efficient? Well, how efficient can you be if you have a shortage of officers? Not very. Not very. Police should be stable, efficient, and organized along military lines. Well, I'm down for the organization. Military lines, that's where things may get blurry and have been blurry. If you're talking about a chain of command, I can go along with that. But that's where it should end as it relates to being similar to being military. Because we all know what our military is for, is to keep our country safe, at times to help the general public during times of tragedy or catastrophe. Our military plays a role in enforcing, well, it plays the role in enforcing martial law. And then what we most know the military for is fighting in wars, unfortunately. So when you bring in just the term military, I think it does a disservice to what law enforcement is actually meant to do. That's just my personal feeling. Fourth principle, police should be under government control. It's that simple. That's what the principle says. The police should be under government control. Well, law enforcement is the government. So, as it relates to government control, are you talking about state government, federal government, local elected officials, county elected officials? In other words, what it comes down to is law enforcement has someone above them in government to answer to. And I did a live stream a couple weeks back. In a regular city, a normal city, typical city, I should say, the mayor appoints the police chief. When it comes to the sheriff, it's a county position. It's also an elected position. Regardless, those two heads of those agencies, those respective agencies, are under the control of a higher level of government. I don't know exactly what that is because it's not really outlined in this. But I'd like to believe that that has something to do with the federal government. So, for example, when an agency, and I'll use the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department because they are under a federal consent decree, when it has been discovered that a law enforcement agency is not following these 9 principles of principal policing, are doing things that are unconstitutional, then another level of government, the Department of Justice, the federal government, will step in and regulate or put stipulations on how this agency is doing its business and conducting its affairs amongst the general public. So I don't know how much control those higher agencies, those federal agencies have over local agencies, but they're supposed to be under the control, under the jurisdiction of higher levels of government. Fifth principle: absence of crime proves police efficiency. The absence of crime is the best proof of police efficiency. I don't agree with that at all. In my opinion, I guess it depends on what type of crime that you're talking about. But generally speaking, crime tends to be a reflection of the poverty that exists. People who are well educated, well employed, well paid tend not to commit the type of crimes that are reflective of people who aren't well educated, well employed, and well paid. So there are a host of crimes that exist in our society that have nothing to do with the efficiency of law enforcement. Now, whether people are obeying the traffic laws, things of that nature, I guess you could get into that. But I think that saying that absence of crime reflects how efficient the police are, I don't buy that one. I'd like to hear what you think of that. So, the sixth principle: police should adhere to their functions. Police should strictly adhere to their executive functions and avoid usurping the powers of the judiciary. Now, this is an interesting one. Law enforcement generally has 2 missions: to enforce the law and to maintain public safety. To enforce the law and to maintain public safety. The last part of this principle, avoid usurping the powers of the judiciary, that's the judiciary branch of government. What that means is members of law enforcement are not supposed to enforce the law and be the judge and jury out in the street. And the best example of members of law enforcement not adhering to this principle is what happened to George Floyd, is what happened to Mike Brown, is what happened to Rodney King, and the list goes on. If you're going to arrest someone, arrest them. Don't met out punishment or justice in the street just because you're a member of law enforcement. This is a really, really key principle, in my opinion. So, Sir Robert Peel, I'm with you. This principle is something that should be at the top of the list when members of law enforcement are being trained. I don't know if it is, but I know it should be. Their job is not to met out justice in the street. That's for the judiciary branch of government, not law enforcement. Another principle: police should maintain a relationship with the public. Police should maintain a relationship with the public that reflects the tradition that the police are the public and the public are the police. That's one of the things that members of law enforcement said to me very early on. And it's what I said at the beginning of this podcast. The police are the public and the public are the police. Now, how do you maintain a relationship with the public that reflects the tradition that the police are that the police are the public? Let me say that slower. And that the public are the police. Well, that's interacting with members of the general public like you are a member of the general public, saying hello, good morning, good afternoon, interacting with the people that you have taken an oath to serve and protect in a manner that is human. If we don't have those type of interactions with law enforcement, that's when people start looking at law enforcement as if they are not a member of the general public, that they wear this uniform and they are separate from us, and we don't know them, we don't have a relationship with them, we fear them, we distrust them. You tend to have trust for people and things which you're familiar. I can become familiar with members of law enforcement that patrol this neighborhood that I live in Los Angeles if I'm interacting with them and they're interacting with me. Key point. Lastly, police should not avenge individuals or the state. Police should not avenge individuals or the state or judge guilty and punish the guilty. I think that ties closely to the principle that says police should adhere to their functions. Punishing the guilty, judging people as guilty, and avenging individuals or the state, that's not your job. Members of law enforcement who engage in that type of behavior, you're no longer acting as a member of law enforcement. You are acting on behalf of yourself. So these are the principles that were created by Sir Robert Peel in London back in 1829. And those principles are still relevant today. They are part of law enforcement training. Now, you'd have to ask individual members of law enforcement how much these principles are driven home during their training. Is it glossed over? Is it a checkbox? Is it something that they just check off? We covered principal policing. Everybody knows who Robert Peel is, and this is how we should be policing. But from the feedback I've received from law enforcement over the past 8 years, a lot of training has to do with making sure that they maintain their own safety from a tactical standpoint. How do I make sure that I go home every night? There's not a huge emphasis or an emphasis really at all on how to go about spending what winds up being 90% of your time being a member of law enforcement, which is interacting with people like you and I and communicating with people like you and I. Not a whole lot of training in that. And so the paradigm needs to be flipped. Members of law enforcement need to spend more time being trained on how to go about their duties, acting within these 9 principles of principal policing. So I hope this helped. Give me your feedback, and I'll see you next time.